This episode of Dispatches from Planet Albany is brought to you with support by New York State United Teachers, which represents more than 600,000 educators and school-related professionals in New York. Dispatches is also supported by the public affairs firm O'Donnell and Associates. For more information, check out o'donnellsolutions.com.
I say generally with polls, I've mentioned this thing about their Snapchats not predictive. Their snapshots, not Snapchats, not predictive.
They could be Snapchats in the future with the right pollster on social media.
I've also declared war on potholes, so here's the first shot across the bow.
Well, as you know, with Planet Albany, there's always something that makes the planet turn.
And it's this amazing view of D.C., and Eddie Vedder comes out. And he goes, "You have a cigarette?" And I've never smoked in my life, but if I had, I wish that was the moment.
And this strategy takes us from potholes to knotholes.
I would like to say it was a pleasure, Mr. Kim. But I'm on the road.
I'm David Lombardo, and this is Dispatches from Planet Albany, a WCNY podcast about power and politics and state government. And on this episode, we're unpacking a Manhattan Institute poll from October that offered a status check on the race for governor of New York that flew in the face of conventional wisdom about a Republican's chances for a statewide office in the blue state and was contrary to some of the polling we've seen on this issue by the Siena Research Institute. To discuss the results and how they were achieved, we're joined on the program by Jesse Arm, who was previously a pollster and project manager at the marketing firm Applecart and is now vice president of external affairs for the Manhattan Institute. Welcome to the show, Jesse, and thanks for agreeing to unpack some of these numbers with us.
Sure, happy to chat with you.
So you found that in this snapshot from October that Representative Elise Stefanik had a 1-point edge over Governor Kathy Hochul, 43% to 42%, with about 16% choosing someone else or not having a choice at this point. Can you explain how you went about contacting registered voters, how many you sample for this, and how you ended up coming up with a representative sample for this electorate?
Absolutely. So we conducted polling between October 22nd and 26th of this year. We surveyed 600 likely voters for the 2025 New York City mayoral election and then 300 registered voters across New York State. We drew the sample in the same way that it's traditionally done from a national voter file, and the New York City likely voter sample was weighted to reflect the 2025 electorate. That included changes that we observed in the mayoral primary and in early voting to date at that point on the 22nd of October through the 26th. That includes factors like higher youth turnout and higher Manhattan and Brooklyn turnout. Both samples were separately weighted on gender, age, education, county, ethnicity, party registration, and party identification as well. And the statewide sample was a combination of the 600 likely New York City voters as well as the 300 registered voters, and then we reweighted to account for population distribution. We collected responses via mixed mode approach, so SMS texts, live call to landline, and live calls to cell phones as well. And we conducted the survey in English, Spanish, and Mandarin. Our margin of error is roughly 4%, plus minus, and that's for the New York City sample, and then a little lower, 3.3% plus minus for the full New York statewide sample.
Well, let's stay with the idea of creating a statewide sample by using the 600 likely New York City voters and 300 registered voters elsewhere in the state. Is that something you've ever done before? Because it seems like you're kind of combining apples and oranges when you take that likely voter pool and combine it with a registered voter pool in other parts of the state.
Yeah, it's not something we've done before with Manhattan Institute polling. It's something I have done before in private polling. And yeah, we account for it by reweighting on the back end to account for some of these changes. I should know that there was another poll by JL Partners, which was released in the New York Post, I think about a week or two after ours came out, that found a similar result. Kathy Hochul was, I believe, up by 2 or 3 points within the margin of error again, and that is obviously inconsistent with what other large public pollsters who rely more on online panels as a larger portion of their sample, like Siena, in collecting their survey results, which show Hochul up by a much wider margin. Although the latest Siena poll, which came out today, does show Hochul's lead sliding. She's down 5 points from where she was the last time Siena released data about a few weeks ago.
So let's talk about the margin of error for this poll. You mentioned that it's plus or minus, I think, 3.3 percentage points. And I'm interested in how you arrive at that number, because I'm able to replicate it when I plug in, say, a sample size of 900, like you contacted, a confidence interval of 95%, and an electorate of about 12 million. But because you're weighting these results on the back end the way you are, does that impact the margin of error? Should it actually be higher? Should there be an expectation of more variation than just 3.3 points either way?
No, we calculate the margin of error by the same standards, which are kind of industry standard across the board. You factor in the entire population, and then you account for the people that you polled in the response.
So the design effect shouldn't cause a higher margin of error here than a poll that is not doing that same weighting?
Not in this instance. I'd have to spend time and go back and look at all of the data we have. I thought we were going to talk about more about the race and dynamics, but I'd be happy to send you additional comments on that afterward if you'd like.
So looking at this survey, you've got basically a report card on part of it, because we have had the New York City mayor's results already, and that's sort of baked into the statewide results. And in the New York City mayor's result, you had Curtis Sliwa, the GOP candidate, getting about 19% in the race for mayor about 2 weeks prior to Election Day. He ended up around 7%. How do you think about that number? Is that a reflection of the fact that he was kind of like a third-party candidate in this race, and third-party candidates are typically harder to poll and often have inflated support in a poll versus actual voting? Or does that raise any concerns for you about the size of the GOP voters in your New York City sample?
David, I think it's mostly a reflection of the fact that Donald Trump went to Twitter in the days following our survey and told every Republican in New York City not to vote for Curtis Sliwa and to instead vote for Andrew Cuomo.
So you don't feel like anything is wrong with the Republican sample size that you have from New York City, for the statewide race at least?
No, I think it's a reflection of the Trump endorsement of Andrew Cuomo, which came after Fielding.
So I guess the reason I'm interested in that is because you've got Kathy Hochul getting about, I think, 52% of the vote in New York City, which is a sharp contrast to what we saw in 2022, where I think she was about 70%, and Harris was at about 68% 2 years later amongst the New York City voters. So when you look at that drop, does that make sense to you, or is that something where it makes you go, boy, I wonder about my sample at all in New York City?
No, I mostly think this is a reflection of the fact that Kathy Hochul is a uniquely unpopular figure, including by a large swath of Zohran Mamdani's supporters in the city. Anecdotally, we saw just in, well, this isn't really anecdotal, it's reflected for anyone who wanted to see it. I think you saw these images, right, of Hochul coming out at the Mamdani rallies in the later stages of this race, catching boos and jeers from Mamdani's audience, Mamdani having to both sort of walk her on and off of the stage to ensure that the audience didn't really kind of reject her whole cloth. So clearly there's a portion of the electorate in New York City, at least, that was supportive and enthusiastic about Zohran Mamdani, but feels much cooler toward Kathy Hochul. What happens between now and November of this year, or rather November of 2026, I think is an open question. We've got 12 months for Kathy Hochul to sort of make her case to the people. And also she's going to go through a blistering primary in that time. I think it's a primary that she's very likely to win. So time will tell, but she'll come out of that race arguably trying to make the case to left of center voters in the Democratic primary that she has the progressive bona fides to push through. On the same time, she's trying not to damage her potential in the general election. Whether or not you believe this race will be competitive, whether or not you believe it will be a race within the margin of error or a 20-point race, there will be money poured in. There will be attention paid to this race.
That's for sure.
Elise Stefanik is a national figure. She has fundraising prowess. She has media credibility and attention. So all eyes will be on New York, even if the polls don't continue to tighten as they have been.
And it's a good point you make about this being a snapshot in time and a reflection of the mood right now, as opposed to potentially a year from now. Looking outside of New York City, though, Republicans are expected, and traditionally do, outperform Democrats by a wide margin, say, in upstate and on the suburbs. But even in the upstate parts of New York, there are some blue pockets, and you appear to have taken note of that with the way that you broke up your crosstabs into upstate urban and upstate rural areas. For party enrollment, though, in these groups, you've got Democrats accounting for about 28% of upstate urban voters, and Republicans are 42%, with basically the reverse for the upstate rural communities. Is it possible that those tabs were mislabeled?
The margins of error on those tabs are massive because you're talking about small subsamples within a 300 voter statewide oversample. The oversample is primarily for us to go and do the back end weighting and come to defensible position on what the statewide gubernatorial race looks like. But if you go really deep on subsample crosstabs from way upstate, you're going to have massive margins of error. So, I mean, we're all about transparency, and we put up our full crosstabs every time, which is non-standard for pollsters in this space. The Manhattan Institute is a public policy think tank, not first and foremost a polling firm. When large polling firms put out public information on races, they oftentimes do not include the crosstabs. You can reach out to these folks and they will not share them with you either.
Very true.
We're seeking to kind of enter into this space. We believe in maximal transparency, but the flip side of that is then you've got a whole lot of stuff for people to nitpick when they don't find results that they don't like. And obviously, you know, when you go into these subsamples, I mean, I'm not going to litigate every kind of question there with you because these are massive margins of error.
Sure, and I don't think it's a nitpicking. It's some of these results might be counter to what you might expect. So looking at the upstate urban vote, you've got Stefanik winning 63% and Hochul winning 19%. I mean, how big of a margin of an error are we talking here that could actually see that play out in November or even be reflective of the mood right now?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting findings from this poll is that while partisan loyalty was remaining strong across the electorate, and most voters were definitely aligned with their party, regardless of the Democratic nominee. There's an interesting takeaway here with the Democratic socialist distinction versus the traditional liberal distinction. That was a question that we asked Democratic respondents.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you, Jesse, but I mean, does anything make sense, though, on that upstate urban turnout? I mean, it would seem like there's a real problem right there if you've got Stefanik getting 63% in communities like Syracuse, Albany, Rochester, Buffalo, and Hochul only getting 19%. I mean, you talked about the margin of error there. So
yeah, it's something like a 20-point margin of error when you're talking about those subsamples.
So you think it could make sense 40-40 is what you're saying?
But if you want to look at the macro state distinction between statewide versus the city, which we can do, where the margin of error is not so vast that we can make inferences about that. One thing that I thought was particularly striking, which is what I was noting earlier, is that in New York City, you've got more than half of Democratic voters who do opt for saying that they are traditional liberals, whereas 47% said they were socialist. Now, we have to think a little bit about what was going on. Again, polling is a snapshot in time. It's not predictive per se. We have to think about what was going on in the city at that time versus what was going on in the information environment statewide. In the city, you had a full-on campaign heavily funded against socialism. So socialism as a concept was, it seems, negatively polarized by voters who identified themselves as Democrats, suggesting that more of them were classifying themselves as traditional liberals relative to socialists. And this is really striking because in the comparison with the Democrats in the rest of the state, who are typically thought of as and assumed to be more conservative, we found that In New York City, in the state outside New York City, 55% identified as socialist, while 45% identified as traditional liberal. So that opens up the question, right? Has the Mamdani candidacy driven New Yorkers in the city away from socialism rather than toward it? And I do think that remains an open question. On the Republican side, we asked a similar question about traditional conservatives and MAGA voters, and we saw more traditional result, what you'd expect. New York is a bluer state, has bluer Republicans, and in New York City, something like 55% identify as traditional conservatives, while only 45% identify as MAGA, and those numbers are more closely split statewide.
Well, yeah, you bring up an interesting point with the idea of how people identify also more broadly, and I want to stick with that idea of party identification, because you weight by party ID, which is something you don't often see with some of the name brand pollsters, so to speak. So I'm curious, what do you weight to then if you're going to weight by party ID? Because there doesn't seem to be a verifiable measure, but rather an assumption based on historic polling that you might have access to.
Well, we identify based on party identification and party registration. The reason we do that is because particularly in this mayoral election, you saw a massive amount of people who in the year leading up to the mayoral race re-registered to participate in the Democratic primary. So we give greater weight to traditional party registration because it's more indicative of where people will be in a given year. But yeah, a lot of the reason that I think we saw some ideological funkiness with people who identify, or rather with people who are registered Democrats but are describing themselves as conservative, is because they changed their registration to participate in the Democratic primary. As you know, I'm sure, I know you're based up in Albany, but if you hang out in the circles of a place like the Manhattan Institute, it's not a rare thing to talk to people who are sort of ideologically conservative or ideologically moderate and really identify themselves as Republicans or independents, but who are registered Democratic voters in New York City. And those are the kinds of people who I think voted for Andrew Cuomo in the primary, or relatively high turnout, showed out, but we'll show up again for Elise Stefanik in November of 26.
Well, finally, there's a concept in the polling industry known as herding, basically where pollsters will essentially cook the books to keep their numbers.
I don't think we could be credibly accused of that.
No,
right?
and that's what I'm going to say. You're clearly not herding.
Well, the truth is there are only two people polling, or three people. I've seen consistent polls out from Siena. We did this one poll out, which is primarily a poll of New York City likely voters with an oversample statewide to give us a picture of what the New York gubernatorial race looks like a year out. And then I saw that one poll that I don't know if the New York Post commissioned, but the New York Post covered from JL Partners, which also suggested the race was in the margin of error.
But yeah, the point is you guys clearly are not hurting. And I was curious, when you come out with numbers like this, when you crunch the math and you go, okay, this is our methodology, this is what we've got, is any part of you go, boy, I feel like I'm out on a ledge, I'm nervous about this? Or do you go, you know what, we've done the polling, we know what we're doing, this is our method, and we stand by it? And as you pointed out, here are our numbers. You can check our math.
Yeah, well, that's why we go for the full transparency approach. And you can't really have herding if there's only two people polling the race or three people polling the race. But that's definitely a phenomenon that we see in presidential politics.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll be back in the Empire State, I think, fairly soon, hopefully.
Well, is any of that future polling, or maybe even the October polls that we're talking about, was that informed at all by your experience prior to the New York City mayoral primary? Because the primary elections, ranked choice votings, can be really difficult to poll. I know in the first round you had Cuomo with, I think, 43% of the vote, up about 13 points over Zoran. So is that a one-off in your perspective, or do you learn from that type of experience as well? Does that shape your work moving forward?
We had Cuomo where every other pollster had him in the weeks before the primary election. The outliers went in the other direction on that one. I don't think there was more than one or two polls that showed Zoran with anything I don't think there were any polls that showed Zoran with a lead reflective of the one that he actually gained.
No, correct.
Following the ranked choice results. But look, the biggest thing with these things is to watch the trend lines. It was clear that Mamdani was picking up poll after poll after poll in the weeks leading up to the primary result. And then Mamdani won big. And look, The polls leading up to the New York City mayoral election, the general election, also showed the race tightening as Eric Adams dropped out, as Curtis Sliwa became kind of more of a gadfly than he already was, and the president weighed in to tell Republicans in New York City that a bad Democrat is preferable to, I don't know, his little communist or whatever the phraseology he used in that particular Truth Social post was. But the trend line was reflective there too. I mean, Zoran did obviously underperform vastly relative to how Democratic nominees for mayor usually perform in New York City, but he even underperformed what a lot of the polling showed for him several weeks out as well. So I think on obviously, putting aside like what Atlas Intel reflected or whatever, but our polling on the New York City mayoral result ended up being fairly close to the mark. But I think in terms of like what Zoran collected, but I think that it's also the same thing is going on with the gubernatorial race to a certain extent, right? Like this race will tighten over time. But then, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked also if like Hochul moderates following her primary victory and begins to build her lead back up again. It's way too soon to tell. And there are going to be massive storylines this year relating to taxes, free buses, the Mamdani policing program, how he decides to tackle disorder or not, mental health issues. All of these things will, the relationship with the president, there will be many, many headlines between now and November of 2026. And it's, a fool's errand to try and predict what will happen then. But we'll be taking those snapshots along the way and trying to figure out, as will many other I think more public pollsters will begin doing so.
Most definitely. Well, we've been speaking with Jesse Arm. He is the Vice President of External Affairs for the Manhattan Institute. Jesse, thank you so much for making the time and helping us unpack these numbers. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Talk to you soon, David.
And before we sign off for this episode, I wanted to let listeners know about this limited time opportunity to support Dispatches from Planet Albany and get a little something in return besides this high-quality podcast. If you make a $50 contribution or a commitment of $5 a month, we'll give you a 12x9 Planet Albany poster. Information about this limited time offer is in the episode description.